Dear Dr. Vandrich, ladies and gentlemen, honored guests from afar, from the G7 country context, from the G20 think tank communities and far beyond, I'm very honored to welcome all of you here today, here in Berlin, in a physical format, to actually meet in person, to take this consultation process that we've spun now over the last months one step further and take it further towards policy making to Wednesday, basically, where we submit our recommendations to our Federal Chancellor Olaf Scholz and discuss them with him in order to then also see which recommendations can be taken up, how they are being discussed and reflected on within the political context. I very much thank you for coming. I'm looking forward to the deliberations of the coming 2 days. I would like to thank the Friedrich Ebert Foundation for hosting us and would like to, of course, thank our partners. I would like to thank the Aspen Institute. Stormy is with us. I would like to thank the the German Council on Foreign Affairs, Mrs. Schmucker is with us, as well as, of course, the Global Solutions Initiative. My colleague Dennis Snower will talk to us in a minute for the very good collaboration in the past months. We are in a time of multiple crises. It was emphasized already. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is shattering the carefully crafted peace order. A hunger crisis is looming, a climate and biodiversity crisis, a debt crisis, and polarization processes in all societies around the globe are challenging the orders that we've built on the global level just as much as on the regional and national levels and in our local communities. And the setting of priorities becomes even more important. The assuring that our capacities to act and not just react remain existing and enable us to face these crises in reflected manner. That means that scientifically based policy advisory activities, such as those that we have carefully deliberated over the past months, take on a new form or a heightened form of responsibility. Why? Because it is on the one side about bringing systematic research, empirically based or theory-led research together, bringing different subject area analyses together and into close dialogue with each other, and assure that our policy advisory activities are based on systematic research, but at the same time reflect these insights out of the perspective of conflicts of interest, by taking the complexities of the real world, so to say, into account, and also reflecting on the political context, the social context, the cultural context that they are supposed to enrich, that they are supposed to be applied in. Now, in our communiqué, we are formulating these priority areas by putting an emphasis on 8 fields. And I just want to mention 4, and Dennis Snower, my colleague, will outline the other 4. If we talk about priority setting, I think it's very clear that we need to end the pandemic. We need to invest, and we urge the G7 to take further lead or to further lead the ending of the pandemic by investing into vaccines, into vaccine production, but also into the mid and long-term strategies that assure vaccine development and production in across the world, as well as invest into capacity building processes, dialogue processes that build awareness that is crucial, that forms the basis for the openness to get vaccinated within societies. We urge the G7 to lead the way on stabilizing our climate, assure that the nationally determined contributions that our countries have been formulating with regard to CO2 reductions actually line up with long-term strategies that have been discussed at the COP last year in Glasgow. Third, we urge the G7 to assure that this recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, and Dr. Fendrich mentioned it, underlined the importance already, is just, that the recovery from the pandemic, as well as the great transformation towards CO2 reduction and the stabilizing of our climate, is actually socially just. We have a situation where we have seen in the past 1.5 to 2 years how high-income economies could mobilize up to 16% of their GDP for balancing the effects of the COVID-19 economy. The big transition economies could mobilize around 3 to 6%, and least developed countries around 1.6%. Of their GDP. These are the data of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. So we see here a situation where the risk of global inequities being sharpened is a tangible risk, is a risk that we need to face, and we need to face front on. And here we call on the G7 to contribute to dialogues, to foster policy making that explicitly invests into the structures that are crucial for societal resilience, for the capacity of societies to act in situations of multiple crises. And these are the investments into social security systems, into healthcare systems, and into educational systems. And fourth, we would like to urge the G7 and all of us to remember the promises and the decisions that we have indeed taken already as a world society. And these are summarized within the Agenda 2030 and in the climate goals formulated in Paris in 2015. Remembering them in the sense of ramping up ambition and assuring that we are putting ourselves back on track, which means that we actually accelerate SDG implementation and start thinking explicitly, systematically, and in close dialogue with each other about a beyond 2030 agenda, which has to probably also face the catching up that we need to do when we reflect on our progress in the coming of the past few years. I thank you all for coming. I thank you for all your contributions to this process of bringing our research together, putting it into trans-regional dialogue, and trying to find ways of moving beyond the level of single studies that are going in depth, in particular shaped by particular disciplinary and interdisciplinary perspectives, and lifting those onto a higher level of abstraction and onto a level which can actually contribute to policy making and address the G7. Thank you.
Dr. Fendrich, Professor Hornidge, absolutely delighted to be here at this important occasion, summarized perfectly by the motto here, fostering global cooperation in a contested geopolitical environment. Keeping multilateralism alive under a new geopolitical world order is a weighty and terribly important task. The old world order, that has been shattered by Russia's invasion of the Ukraine rested on simple principles. People are of equal dignity and worth. Multilateral problems need to be solved multilaterally. And the entire process can be pushed along through liberal democratic means humanized through global collective action. And you, Professor Hornidge, have already emphasized the importance of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Accord in that regard. These pillars have been shaken, and it is our job to make sure that a strong narrative emerges that makes multilateral cooperation with regard to global problems possible again. It's often claimed that multilateralism has failed, and we must not submit to that temptation, because conflict breeds conflict. And whatever we do now, we must keep in clear view our ultimate goal, which is the reestablishment of a rules-based, values-based multilateral order that recognizes basic human rights, and the reestablishment of the international anti-war norm, making it inadmissible for national boundaries simply to be changed by force. This is terribly important, not only with regard to the issues that you have articulated, the pandemic, the food crisis, and much else. There are many other crises waiting in the wings: biodiversity loss, financial instability, antimicrobial resistance, energy, food, water insecurity, digital disruption, manipulation, and much more. And these matters are global challenges that need to be captured globally. Our children and our children's children will not forgive us if we ignore these global challenges just because there is a war going on in the Ukraine. We need the systemic transformation that you talked about. And these systemic transformations in the past have always been driven by value-driven narratives. And in this geopolitical conflict, the choice of narrative becomes terribly important. The dominant narratives now, Putin's threat to the West and NATO's threat to Russia, they lead us to escalating conflict, because each side sees itself as a victim of aggression, demonizes its adversary, and that justifies further violence. This is not the way forward. We need constructive narratives, and constructive narratives are never driven by vengeance or grievance. They rest on mutual respect and perspective-taking, as well as compassion. And in seeking constructive narratives, it's important to recognize that, of course, we will have to keep in view the main pillars on which the multilateral order has been founded, that is, the equal dignity of people, multilateral efforts for multilateral challenges. But in addition, in this world, it will be important to recognize that large concentrations of economic power, political power, technological power, military power are very destructive of the principle that people have equal dignity and worth. And they're also destructive of the incentive to work together for a common purpose. The crises that you have outlined, Anna-Katharina, are of major importance. And I'd just like, as you've said, emphasize a few that deserve some further emphasis in addition to those that you've mentioned. The debt crisis, on top of slower growth, higher inflation, is a major problem. High debt in emerging markets and developing countries, they amount to about 40% of global product. And the COVID crisis has increased total indebtedness to a 50-year high, equivalent to more than 250% of government revenues. Debt service burdens of middle-income countries are at a 30-year high. Over the next 12 months, the World Bank estimates that as many as a dozen of the developing countries may be unable to service their debt. And 30 years ago, some of us will recall, the developing economies owed most of their debt to governments, official bilateral creditors, they're called, and nearly all of them were in the Paris Club. Nowadays, low and middle income countries owe 5 times as much to commercial creditors as they do to bilateral creditors, and much of this debt is in variable interest rates. Big problems ahead. The G20 set up the Debt Service Suspension Initiative that brought some relief, but it expired at the end of 2021, and we now have the Common Framework for Debt Treatments that goes beyond that, but it has been slow in take-up. So much more action is required. Food shortage, you have already alluded to, and that is going to be a major problem moving ahead. At present, there are 1.6 billion people on Earth who cannot be sure of getting enough food to eat. The Ukraine's food exports feed approximately 400 million people. At the same time, China, the world's largest wheat producer, is having difficulty with its planting. India has had lack of rain. The US in the wheat belt is suffering as well. The Horn of Africa has worst drought in 4 decades. So there are real problems ahead that require global solutions. And they can be managed, but they can only be managed in the spirit of global cooperation. And when that cooperation is impossible on an international level, I think the initiative of Chancellor Scholz to bring together alliances of the willing moves in absolutely the right direction. And then there are problems of digital disruption. The problems of the current digital regime are well known. There is great vulnerability to economic, social, political manipulation on the internet. The social identity formation has been taken over by large companies. They capture our attention. They solicit us to increase their network size. They persuade us to buy certain products and to adhere to certain political philosophies. They are a threat to the functioning of the market system because people get apps for free and give information for free without informed consent. There is inadequate protection of privacy and security, and the entire system leads to widening inequalities of information, inequalities of economic power, and a broad sense of disempowerment. The way forward clearly is not simply through more government control, but through empowering civil society. So this is the time, I believe, when we can defend our values in the digital age and promote progress towards them by democratizing digital governance, giving users control over the data about themselves, both individually and collectively, and thereby enabling individuals to assume their rights of association that they have in the offline world, enable us to protect vulnerable users, all this can be done, and it needs global cooperation. We are in discussion with the European Commission and various national governments on concrete proposals to do this. To address these challenges, it is of vital importance that the G7 presidency work together with the G20 and strengthen multilateral approaches to multilateral problems. That was the important message that you have conveyed, Anna-Katharina. And therefore, it appears highly desirable that a permanent bridge be built between the G7 and the G20 infrastructures. The G7 predates the G20, and at present, the G7 has a critically important role to play, not only by leading by example, but also by showing how the rich world can cooperate with nations that are less fortunate in giving them the means to live up so that we can all live up to our global obligations. That, I believe, was the spirit of Chancellor Scholz's climate clubs. That can be the spirit of future health clubs. Minister Wolfgang Schmidt, welcome. I will cut my speech short because we wish to hear as much from you as possible. Welcome here. And so, because it is so important for the G7 and the G20 to work together to address common challenges, I think this will send a message to the world not to lose faith in multilateralism for global problem solving. Global problems can only be addressed globally, and therefore we have to thank Chancellor Olaf Scholz for inviting the current and forthcoming G20 presidencies, Indonesia, India, South Africa, to the G7 summit in Elmau, as well as Senegal, the presidency of the African Union. So I believe these are troubled and important times, and it is our great pleasure and honor to welcome Minister Wolfgang Schmidt to our midst. He is the head of the federal, the Chancellery and Minister for Special Tasks on the federal level. Mr. Minister Schmidt, it's our pleasure to welcome you here.